So the next sword we're going to look at in the Royal Armouries Windless and Eastern line is known as IX.1106, and it's a longsword in the Royal Armouries. So as with all of the others in this range, there are 6 swords in total in the first range. This is a faithful replica. It's handmade, so there will be tiny variations from one example to another, but basically it's incredibly close, virtually the same in proportions, statistics, weight, balance, taper, obviously length, width, everything else, distal taper included, edge geometry included, a blade cross section, everything you can think of basically. These have been intricately and painstakingly copied from the originals in the Royal Armouries, and these are official, certified by the Royal Armouries and me, and you get a certificate of authenticity with each of these swords. Let's take that top off and have a little look inside and see what you get. This is an unadulterated and unopened one. So here we go, that is how your sword will look when it arrives. This is a longsword. This is a 14th century longsword, but we'll look at that in a minute. And you can see it's immaculately packed, very, very securely. And what you've got in here is your sword, which is wrapped in plastic and covered in oil. You've got the scabbard, which is wrapped in paper. The sword incidentally has a safety cap on the end, so there's no problems with the very pointy point coming through the box or anything like that. It's all securely packed here in this foam packing, and if we just lift this up under here, you can see you've got some windless wax polish to help preserve the sword once you've cleaned the initial oil off it, and you want to look after it, whether it's hang it on your wall or swing it around or cut things with it or whatever. That wax is very, very useful to look after it, and you can see the whole thing is beautifully and securely packaged. And also in here somewhere, there it is inside here is your certificate, your scroll of authenticity, which has got my signature on it, and representatives of Windlass and the Royal Armouries. So let's now unbox this sword and I will show you its features. IX.1106 is a very specific and important type of 14th century longsword, really specialised for armoured combat. It's an armoured knight's sword, but let's have a look at it out of the box. So here it is out of the box. This is IX.1106 according to the Royal Armouries cataloguing number, and this is a knightly longsword of the 14th century, probably mid 14th to late 14th century, so about 1350 perhaps to about 1380s, 90s, something like this. And this is a type of longsword that was particularly popular in the second half of the 14th century, being used by fully armoured knights, and in many ways we're going to see in a second it is specialised for that task. Now the original in the Royal Armouries, IX.1106, was found in Lake Constance. That's right, it was found in a lake where Germany, Austria and Switzerland meet. So we could say loosely that this is a longsword typical of the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany if you like, in the second half of the 14th century, and is the sort of sword that is featured in some of the earliest fencing treatises that we have. That being said, I want to make it clear that this is not a typical, or rather average longsword by modern tastes. It's a hand and a half sword. As you can see, it's got a long grip, can be used by one hand or two. But this is a particularly heavy and very, very stiff sword. So the original, as this replica, weighs 1,775 grams, so 1,775 grams. And it's therefore fairly heavy for its size, and the reason for that is its monstrous blade and pommel. Now let's have a look at those. So the scabbard, as before, is wood lined with leather covering, very nice stitching on the back with a bronze shape. So let's dispense with the scabbard and let's have a look at the sword. So the blade, as you can see, is relatively narrow and tapered to a very acute point. Now let me tell you that this blade shocked me when I was measuring it in the Royal Armouries. I think it shocks anyone who handles it for the first time, because it's surprisingly formed, surprising proportions. It is very beefy, sturdy, and insanely stiff. This is 11 millimeters thick at the base of the blade. It transitions down to about 8 or 9 millimeters in the middle of the blade and goes down to about 6 millimeters just close to the point. Bear in mind, many swords, 6mm near the point, many swords are only 6mm thick at the base of the blade. This one starts out at 11mm and the middle of the blade is still 9mm, which is much thicker than a lot of swords are at the base of the blade. This is a really, really stiff sword, and you can see I can barely flex it at all here. That of course means that it's uniquely well adapted for armoured fighting in the age of plate and mail. Not only can a sword like this be used two-handed, obviously to give blows and give direct thrusts, but it's very, very well adapted to what we call half-swording. That is using the left hand in armour with gauntlets on and obviously gloves on the inside, but used in close-in fighting, in armoured fighting, in order to use the sword a little bit like a miniature poleaxe or a short spear, or almost like a bayonet actually, to get the point into gaps and use the point on the armoured opponents to get into their armpits, anywhere that might be open around their helmet, neck, face, groin, back of the legs, inside of the elbows, these kind of places. So it's incredibly stiff, and it means that when you push with this, there is very little flex in the blade at all, especially when you're supporting it. It becomes a rigid bar. That's not to say that it can't also be used to give blows, and funnily enough, if you're fighting in armour, cuts don't really have any effect on plate armour, of course, but a sword of this robustness and these proportions, it means that giving a full-powered blow into someone's helmet or arm armour, for example, might have more effect than with a thinner, better cutting sword. This is basically like hitting them with a bar. Not to say that it can't have an edge on it, and indeed against unarmoured targets, although this has got quite a broad edge geometry because of its very thick blade and relatively narrow blade. With a good chisel edge put on it, it will of course still do the job against unarmoured targets. Now onto the hilt. The main notable characteristic of this hilt is that enormous wheel pommel, and it should not be understated how big that pommel is, and this was actually quite difficult to get exactly right because there's lots of interesting little tapers and curves on this pommel that you wouldn't necessarily notice at first sight. You'd think, oh, it's just a wheel pommel. No, it's actually quite complicated. So getting this right was quite a challenge. You'll notice the facets of the outside of the wheel pommel here actually taper upwards. This actually tapers, and look at the beautiful shape of that peen block, as it's called here, where the full tang that goes all the way through is peened on the end here. Getting that right as well was quite challenging, but we did it. You can see if you look next to the original, and this has been next to the original, it is exact replica of the original pommel, and it is a big beefy pommel, and it's not an especially long grip, so be aware that as a two-handed sword this is quite a short gripped sword. Okay, so just to be aware of that. And this would have been used two-handed some of the time and one-handed some of the time, and obviously on horseback or on foot. Now in terms of the rest of the hilt, we have a beautifully leather wrapped and cord impressed surface here with risers to make the grip a bit more interesting, and also you notice that riser in the middle is good to stop your hand sliding down if you're using it as a one-handed sword at the time. And then a really quite gracefully shaped crossguard with quillons that droop down at the end. These serve to catch an opponent's blade if, for example, they've cut at you and you cross here and their blade slides down to the base here. It won't come off the end, which means you can wind into their blade while maintaining control of their blade. And you'll notice it has a swell in the middle, and the blade is very well sort of pierced to receive the exact shape of the blade. So the cutout in the top of the guard closely matches the actual shape of the blade itself, which means it's nice and snug and no big gaps there or anything like that. So a beautifully rendered version of IX.1106, as far as I know, the closest replica that's ever been made of that particular sword. And once again, to reiterate, this sword will surprise you in the hand. In my mind, this is almost a specialized knight's armored fighting sword. This is really optimized for fighting in armor, stabbing into things with a very, very rigid blade. And just to remind you as well that as well as being an incredibly close replica, these are hand forged. So there will be tiny variations from one example to another. These are hand forged, they're not CNC milled on a machine or anything like that. They're hand forged by craftsmen who are full-time sword makers. And despite that, they have fixed patterns or models to work from to keep them as close as possible to the originals as we can get, down to the millimetre and down to within a reasonable tolerance of close to the weight. So I actually just weighed this. This comes in at 1,775 grams, which is exactly what the original is. And the point of balance, the distal taper, everything else is exactly like the original. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing IX.1106, and I hope you'll watch the other videos looking at some of the other Royal Armouries swords.